Professor, I appreciate your time. Andrew Bogut isn't a politician. He says he's not affiliated with any political party. So does it surprise you he's been issued with this letter by the Victorian Electoral Commission?
Look, I think it's absolutely astonishing. I think the Victorian Electoral Commission is guilty of constitutional drivel. In this country, we have a freedom of political communication. There's no doubt that this is squarely in there. And Andrew Bogut is completely within his rights to express it.
We have received a statement today from the Electoral Commissioner, Warwick Gately, and he says Mr Bogut hasn't been targeted or treated, he says, any differently to anyone else. This statement says if we receive a complaint, we respond. He says it's quite simple, really. All he needs to do is add his name and an address, which can be a business address, end of story. So to be very clear, if this applies to everyone, where do you think the Electoral Commissions should be drawing the line?
Well, there is no line if this applies to Mr Bogut. If that is the case, then virtually every political story in the Age or the Sydney Morning Herald or the Australian should have a line of disclosure in it. I've written many columns for most newspapers in this country. I've often called for politicians to resign. If that's the case, then every program on every channel and every newspaper should carry it. Now, that is absolutely absurd. And you'd have to ask the question of why poor old Andrew Bogut has been singled out. It's interesting that no one has been singled out with the opposite point of view. But remember, this could apply to members of Parliament. Interesting to trawl through their websites to see what they're saying.
I guess it comes down to the definition of electoral matter. What is the definition of electoral matter? As you say, how does it fall in terms of being defined for comment in newspapers as opposed to actually sending a link to a website, for example?
Well, there's this amazing thing called common sense, and you have to apply that. So, a paid political advertisement and advertisements that are there from a political party that are for a particular purpose, then okay, they fall in the Electoral Act. The personal comments of an individual citizen don't. If I picked someone, I'll pick James Merlino because he's a friend and because I think he's doing a very good job. I'll now say that James Merlino is a rotten Deputy Premier, he's a rotten Minister, and he should resign. Okay, now this program has to come with a political warning. That's how silly it is.
And this happened, this was referring to some comments that were made online. Is the Electoral Act clear, and does it distinguish between social media, for example, and other forms of media?
Look, social media is something that I don't think the law has fully caught up with, but I think the reality is that this type of reasoning would be equally applicable to writing or to a newspaper or to social media. If this is right, we don't have freedom of speech in this country. Now, we clearly do. I think the Electoral Commissioner is guilty of vast overreach and he should retreat as quickly as decently possible.
Well, just to clarify for our viewers, this statement from the AEC, it does acknowledge, it says everyone is entitled to free speech. It does so say, however, if a person publishes that opinion and it's intended or likely to affect how a person votes in an election, then they're saying it must be properly authorised. It says that's the law, it applies to all of us, whether they be a media personality, a member of the public, political party or candidate in an election. In order for an electoral commission to take this sort of action, do they first need to get a complaint about it? Is that how it works?
Yes. You're entitled to free speech subject to only one thing, which is that it can be reasonably regulated. So if you let out fire in a crowded cinema or something like that, and indeed, if you're engaging in political advertising, it's perfectly reasonable to require that it be attributed. But no court in Australia is going to hold that an ordinary citizen expressing their ordinary views is somehow or rather subject to the laws that are meant to apply to politicians and political parties. It's just a nonsensical argument.
And how likely is it that something like this would make it all the way to a court? I mean, how big are the penalties? Are we talking about fines in the first instance? Andrew Bogut has made it clear that if he is issued a fine, then he certainly wouldn't be paying it. So what other penalties could there be?
Well, this is why it's so absurd. So I think the penalties are up around $8,000. But if Mr. Bogut refused to pay it, eventually he would probably be prosecuted for contempt of court. And a failure to abide with that would see him in jail. Can you imagine the political and legal consequences if a person was actually committed to prison for simply publishing his own private political view? Australia would be a laughingstock in terms of human rights around the world.
Professor Greg Craven, it's a fascinating story. I appreciate your insights on it. Thank you.
No problems.